Please give a warm welcome to director Michael Gracey. How you doing, Michael? Thanks for being here.
No, thanks for everyone coming.
When I met you outside, I actually didn't tell you that my favorite movie of all time is All That Jazz. And when I watched your film, I kept thinking about Bob Fosse. Was there an influence there somewhere?
Yeah, huge influence, yeah. I mean, Bob Fosse is one of the greatest directors of all time.
And the reason why I kept thinking about it is the fact that in Bob Fosse's movies, you have pain mixed in with bliss and excitement, and you manage to balance that in your film.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's like the best compliment you could ever pay. Any reference to Bob Fosse, just in the way that he navigates, dark subjects with these incredible, fantastical moments, and with music, and the way that he choreographs not just what's in front of the camera, but the way he choreographs the camera. I mean, his camera work is some of the best that's ever been done. And I had difficulties on Showman just trying to get the choreography of the camera exactly how I wanted it. And Ashley Wallen, who was the choreographer of Showman, who also did the choreography for this, who's phenomenal. So Ash and I have worked together since we were 21. And Ashley would have his hands on the shoulders of the Steadicam operator during Showman because we needed the camera to be here on this count of the song, and then we needed the camera to come around and be facing this way on this count of the song. And unless you're a dancer, you can't do everything to count the way that dancers do. So on this film, Ashley's actually credited for choreography, but also camera operating, because so many of the musical numbers, Ashley's on camera. So the choreographer is actually, the guy is built like a gridiron player, so he's got no problem lugging a camera around.
Going back to the Fosse influence, one of the things that struck me about your film is how unfiltered it is, where Fosse was the same way, that, we're dealing with drug intake, we're dealing with alcoholism and self-destructive qualities, and you don't shy away from that. Was there any point that you felt that you needed to curtail those unfiltered moments in the film?
No, it's a real credit to Rob that he let us go there. There's not many artists that would let you show that dark side to that degree. And so, I was very fortunate that Rob allowed us to go to those places. And then I was very fortunate that Brian from Paramount was okay to go to those places as well. So, yeah, I think it's really hard when you watch a story, particularly when it's of a public figure that has had struggles, and then you end up watching a sort of watered down version where you're sitting there in the audience going, well, I know this isn't the real story, Mm-hmm. And I just think that when you show something really truthful, I think a lot more people can relate to it. Because we don't live in a watered down life. We live a very real life that has got extreme highs and extreme lows, and it's how we all navigate that,
Walk us through the genesis of us seeing it as a monkey. You've been asked this many times.
No, it's the obvious question. So it just came about because a couple of reasons. One is, Rob's not that visually iconic. He's not Elton John. You can put a broad rim hat on anyone, pink round sunglasses with a pink lens and a feather boa, and from 20 meters away, most everyone's going to say Elton John. Freddie Mercury as well, with his mustache and his teeth. Elvis with his hair. They're all very iconic characters that you literally could put in silhouette and most people would be able to pick who it is. Rob isn't visually iconic in that same way. And what happens is you try and cast someone and you're trying to cast an actor to look like Rob. And even if you do an amazing job and find someone who just looks really like him, your mind, the entire film, still plays this game of, oh, he looks like Rob there. Oh, he doesn't look like Rob there. Oh, he's looking like Rob there. He doesn't look like Rob there. That conversation is going on, that chatter is going on in the back of your head the entire time you watch the film. And what makes it even more difficult is, in America, most people don't know what Rob looks like. So then I had a problem the rest of the world over that was that chatter, and the chatter that was going on inside Americans' heads is, who is Robbie Williams? So I just wanted to come up with a visual solve that kind of sidestepped that whole internal conversation. And I just thought there must be another more interesting way to lens the film. And so I went back to the original recordings that I did with Rob. So this all started with a year and a half of just whenever I was in LA, I would go over to Rob's house and we would just sit in his recording studio and just chat. And it was never meant for a film. It was just a conversation.
But why did you start the conversation with him? It was about a documentary, or?
No, in the same way that I think as directors, you just chase great stories. And the thing about Rob is he doesn't not just have great stories, he has a great delivery to those stories. And I said to him, look, I don't know what this is for, but while you still remember these stories, because that's the other thing, for someone who's taken so many drugs and drunk so much alcohol, the fact you can still remember in detail these stories, I was like, I don't know how many years your mind has before it gives up these stories. So let's just record them. And, you know, they might just be, I literally said to him, they might just be for you to listen to in a nursing home one day. But wouldn't that be great? And so that's what we did. And after a year and a half, I would just start chopping up the conversation and trying to make like almost like a radio play, which I would just listen to and try and imagine if it would make a compelling film. And those recordings became the basis of the first draft. So when I had this challenge to myself to try and find a different way into the story, I actually just went back to those recordings. And when I was listening to the recordings, time and time again, Rob would say, you know, I was just out of my mind, but it didn't really matter. They just dragged me up on stage to perform like a monkey. Or he'd say, you know, it didn't really matter. I was just up the back dancing around like a performing monkey. And he said it enough times that I was like, that's actually how he sees himself. He sees himself as a performing monkey. And it's not just when he's on stage. It's he's always performing. He's performing for his dad. He's performing for the kids when he's playing soccer, trying to make out like he's a bigger man than he is. Like he's always got this element where he's putting on a show. And so that is why I thought it could be interesting to represent him as a performing monkey.
You know, I find it fascinating because when I told you I saw the film in Telluride, when I started watching the film, alluding to what you mentioned about Elton John and Freddie Mercury, is that we're seeing all these biopics the way we see them. But your take on this film is how he sees himself, and that's very unique in biopics.
Yeah, and that's why I kept those original recordings. You know, about 80% of what you're listening to is actually taken from those original conversations. Because we tried to redo the voiceover, and it was really difficult because it sounded like someone reading a script, whereas those original recordings is just done in conversation. It's not, because there was no intention for it to ever be for the public. Mm-hmm. So even while they're edited up, they still are the original audio recordings. And I had a really hard time. There's only like a couple of them that we replaced for narrative purposes. And they're not as good as the original recordings because it's Rob reading a script, not Rob just doing what he does best, which is just talking off the top of his head.
So you come up with this idea of him portraying him as a monkey. How difficult was it to go to the studios to get this funded, that we're going to see Robbie Williams as a monkey for 2 hours? And also, did you have to convince Robbie Williams about the idea of him being shown as a monkey nonstop?
Yeah, convincing Rob was very easy. I basically said to him, you know, Rob, if you were going to be an animal, how would you see yourself? And he said with a big grin on his face, a lion. And then there was this awkward pause. And I said, really? And he went, if I'm being honest, no, more like a monkey. And I went, great. And then I pitched him the idea, and he was like, he kind of laughed, and he went, yeah, that sounds great. So Rob was very easy to convince. People financing this film weren't nearly as easy to convince. That took many years of my life. Unfortunately, you know, musical biopics, because you're spanning quite a period of time. It's not like a kitchen sink drama. You're doing concerts and at a huge scale, and it's quite a big number. And then you add a digital monkey on top of that, and you just double that number because the monkey's in every shot. So it makes no sense at all. And it's some of the shortest pitch meetings I've ever had in my life. Because I would say things like, you know, they'd say, the director of The Greatest Showman and Robbie Williams, this is overseas where they know who he is. They'd say, fantastic, yeah, how much do you need? And I'd say, well, before we get into that, just one thing, Rob's going to be portrayed in the film as a monkey. And they would sort of laugh and say, oh, you know, sort of dream sequence, or, you know, he catches a reflection of himself in the mirror. And I go, no, the entire film. To which they would say, this is the end of the meeting. And it would be the end of the meeting. It literally, some of the meetings went as long as the story I just told you. I don't know whether they thought I was just taking the piss and making a mockery of the entire conversation. But I did have one person who did say, right, so if this monkey thing doesn't work out, you can just go back to Robbie, right? And I was like, no, there's no going back. We're going to shoot a guy in a motion capture suit with dots on his face. Like, there is only the monkey.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm going back to the motion capture. So the audience understands, you had an actor, Jono Davis, who plays the entire role in a suit, motion capture. And then we hear Robbie Williams' voice.
No, so yeah, this is a really good thing to clarify. In the same way that Andy Serkis, you know, plays Gollum or Caesar from Planet of the Apes, which were amazing films, by the way, lacking some hummable tunes, but other than that, amazing films. It's Andy Serkis's voice, and it's Rob's voice in the voiceover, but it's Jono Davies doing Rob's voice the entire film.
And what about the eyes that are so expressive?
So everything performance-wise is Jono. He studied Robbie like nobody's business, and he's a British actor. He's going to go on to become massive. He is so stupid talented. And I was constantly, as was Rob, was just blown away. We actually had an amazing screening at, it's another film festival, but you mentioned Telluride, so I'll mention Toronto.
Yeah,
nothing like this. But I had an amazing moment because I got to watch the film for the first time at Toronto, and I had Rob sitting next to me here, and next to him was Jono. And I'd watched the film a few times with Rob next to me, but I'd never watched it with Jono, and Jono had never watched the film with Rob, let alone sitting next to him. And it was the first time Jono was watching the film. So you got to understand, like, we spent like 3 years in production on this from what we did, we shot it, and then we spent 2.5 years in post, and a lot of that post sometimes was bringing Jono back in to perform in the motion capture suit. So, this guy's dedicated 3 years of his life to this. And he really did the deepest dive. Even his voice, he makes his voice higher when he plays younger Robbie, because Robbie's voice as a teenager was crazy high, to the point where I called him out on it and was like, "You sound ridiculous." And then he would play me clips of Rob and be like, "This is how high his voice was." And so he evolved his performance, he evolved vocally, he did this amazing work. And then when we were watching it in Toronto, I could see out of the corner of my eye in the dark that in the really full-on scenes, which there are many, Rob would just reach over and put his hand on Jono's knee. And it was super sweet. And it was almost him just saying, one, thank you, but also two, that was a lot. And it was just a really touching moment that we had.
To clarify, when we watch the musical numbers, and you spoke about the choreography, is Jono
that's
the one
Jono
that is dancing? But
yeah.
he's dancing with the capture.
A motion capture suit on and a camera sticking out the front of his face. Yeah, capturing his whole facial expression.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. There'll be some behind the scenes coming out which are mind blowing. Like Jono going down Regent Street in his little, motion capture suit. It's quite a sight.
From my perspective, the Regent Street sequence is mind blowing. Can you walk us through getting that whole sequence done?
Yeah, I was actually telling Jordan Roberts just before this screening. Jordan, are you still here? Jordan's an amazing writer, and I haven't seen him for years, and he lives down here now, so it was such a treat. So the short version of that story is, Regent Street is this beautiful curved street in London, for those of you who have been. And every time I would go to London as an Australian, I would walk down the street and I would look at this street and think, why has no one done a musical number on this street? Like, it's screaming for a musical number. It's just so iconic. And then I went about trying to do a musical number on that street, and I realized why no one should ever try and do anything on that street.
And with a monkey to boot.
Yeah, but I mean, we would go down in the middle of the night, myself and a handful of dancers with Ashley, and we'd dance down the street to try and work out how many nights we'd have to shut it down for, what sections of the street we'd need to shut down. And we got it down to 4 nights. That was the best we could do. And we were just told flat out, it's never happening. You're never shutting down Regent Street for 4 nights to film. And then they said, and it's going to be rolling stops, where you have to stop the traffic, run out, do your shooting for 15 minutes, and then get off the street and let the traffic go through, because it's a bus route as well. So I was like, this is never going to work. We can't do rolling stops. It took 1.5 years of paperwork to lock down Regent Street, and a lot of people and a lot of favours. We had to get the Crown Estate involved because it's actually owned by the Royals. And there were terrorist reports. It was like the craziest thing ever. If you go to Regent Street at the moment, there is trees that are in these huge plantations all the way down the street. They're incredibly ugly. And they're also not period correct. They weren't there at the time when Robbie and the Take That Boys sort of signed their deal with BMG. So we had to remove them. And they charged me per tree to remove them. And I was arguing and saying, isn't it the same forklift that's moving the trees? And they go the whole length of the street. So it was such an expensive operation. We had to pay out the shops. We had to, it was an enormous undertaking. It's the most expensive musical number in the film. We had to rehearse it because we only had 4 nights, so we had to go on with that crew and all those dancers and just start shooting. So the week before, we taped out Regent Street in a studio outside of London, this enormous aircraft hangar. And we taped out every rubbish bin, every bus stop, every curb. We got the taxis, we got the double-decker bus, we rehearsed the traffic, the dancers, the cranes, the cameras, everything. And I was very excited because towards the end of the week, I saw these signs being put up at Regent Street explaining to the general public that the street is going to be shut down on these dates, on these nights. And I thought, it's actually going to happen. And then at the end of the week, on the Friday, and we were starting to shoot on the Sunday night, I was told that the Queen died the night before, and it was 10 days of mourning, and we would not be shooting. Just to be clear, for anyone shooting in England, you don't get insurance on the death of the Queen. So we lost the money.
Wow.
And I was told, just forget about that number. You're going to have to do without it. I was like, I'm not forgetting about that number. But it took another 5 months to get back on to Regent Street because we had to wait for the 10 days of mourning. They then had the funeral for the Queen, and then they had the coronation for the King. So by the time all those things were done and we were allowed back on the street, it was 5 months. And for anyone who's involved in independent films, because this was an independent film, you have a bond and a bank and a delivery date, and we completely missed the delivery date.
Wow.
Because of that one number.
Wow.
It was worth it. But it was...
And you mentioned Weta and CGI. How did it work where, using that musical number as an example, you shot in regular film and then the special effects came in, or?
Yeah, so my background's in animation and visual effects, so it's something I understand deeply, and there are shots in this film that I still have no idea how they did them. Like, I understand that when you have any shot, you've got to track. You've got to find a point to track off, and that's how you get the camera tracking information. But it's difficult if there's flashing lights. It's even more difficult if there is dry ice on the ground and no points to track off because everything's moving. And then you're putting a digital character into that dry ice. I mean, there are shots in this where employees at Weta would come up to me and just be so angry at what I shot because of the level of difficulty. And I kept saying, yeah, but Luke Miller, the visual effects supervisor, said it was all right. But I know exactly what you're talking about because there is no way I could do this shot. I have no idea how to even begin to do this shot. There are just fundamentally, on a visual effects level, there's shots in this film that blow my mind. To this day, every time they come up, I grin and think, that's an impossible shot. So the work they did and the passion that they had for it, and we had a window with the artists. We got like the best of the best artists, but we were jammed between the new Avatar film and then the new Planet of the Apes film. We had this window where we had the best of the best working on Better Man, and then we went over. So there were certain artists who refused to go on to other projects until they'd finished their work on Better Man. And they literally said, if you take me off this film, I'll leave the company. So it became a real passion piece for the artists working on it. And it just shows in the work. The work's incredible. But I was so fortunate to have the team that we had. You know, every big company, you know, they have hundreds and hundreds of artists. So it's not about the name of the company. It's not about Weta or Industrial Light and Magic or the Moving Picture Company. All of those companies have incredible artists. It comes down to the team that ends up working on your particular project. And the team we had on this were breathtakingly good. So, yeah, they made the film. And they have a real... Their level of passion for what they have contributed is just remarkable.
When I watch the film, and it recurs, of course, the monkey visual, and it reverberates. And every time we see the monkey, I keep thinking different things, you know, self-hate, etc. Is that something that when you latched on to the notion of the monkey, that you understood the multiple interpretations throughout the scenes?
So I think that part of it is premeditated and was thought through. Obviously, I want to represent Rob's mental health and the struggles that he has with that. And so I thought being able to see himself and be able to ignore himself and try and numb himself with alcohol and drugs, and then ultimately fight himself, all the way through to accepting himself. That was a big part of the original conceit. There are other things that I knew it would be easier to see yourself in a monkey somehow than an actor. I think there's just something where we feel more for animals that are suffering than we do humans. I think we're very numb in cinema watching humans suffer. It's just a big part of the history of cinema. Whereas you watch an animal suffer and people really, their hearts go out to it. I think it's, there's something where there's an innocence to an animal. So when an animal is hurting itself, it breaks that innocence. And there is something deeply troubling that we find when we watch scenes where there's self-harm involved, or even, you know, to any degree of self-harm. I mean, Rob doing drugs and taking alcohol are all forms of him self-harming, you know. So there was that, which was conscious. And then there is, it didn't hit me, when you spend time around famous people, you're very aware that they walk in a room and everyone stares at them. And it doesn't matter if someone else in the conversation is talking, no one is looking at that person. They're all just staring at the famous person. And this kind of hit home to me when we had 20 minutes of the film, and because we were going to be late delivering it, at Cannes Film Festival, we got the distributors internationally who'd paid for the film together in a theater, and we just played 20 minutes of the film. Kind of to say, it's going to be late, but it's going to be great, so thanks. And then Rob was there with me, and then we got up afterwards, and as I was talking to them, as I'm talking to you now, there wasn't a single person in the room looking at me. They were all just staring at Rob. And I said to them, I said, you know, the thing that's just, I'm very aware of is that none of you are looking at me. You're all looking at Rob. And that is one of the advantages of having a monkey, is that in a scene, even when he's not speaking, you still are completely fascinated by the monkey. You're still staring at the monkey, even though he's just sitting at a table with a bunch of other people and someone else is speaking, but you cannot help but look at Rob. And I just think it's such a true depiction of what it is to put a star up on the screen, which I'd never really, that was never the intention, you know. It just is one of the fallouts of having a monkey in the scene. So things like that, when you said, was it all thought through? No. You know, a lot of it was thought through, and then there's all these other things that came once the monkey was realized. And what I will say is, every time we added a monkey to the scene, so Fridays were our deliveries from Weta, and then we would edit them into the scene over the weekend, and we'd watch it on the Monday. And that was the post-process, if you will. And the thing we did with Weta is we never did shots. We only ever did sequences. So we never judged a monkey as a individual shot, which is usually what you do when you're doing big visual effects projects. We only ever did full sequences. And for anyone who's a filmmaker out there or a producer, make sure you get your visual effects in a sequence, not in shots. Because it changes the way you look at it. You're watching it in context. And the reason I bring that up is that every single Monday when we sat down to watch whatever was delivered on the Friday, it was like Christmas Day. When you've been looking at a guy with dots on his face and a camera hanging out the front of his face and a gray wetsuit, and then all of a sudden you have this full color monkey who has captured all the same little nuances in the performance, but he is flesh and blood. He's not, he's digital, but to your eye, he's flesh and blood. Those Mondays were some of the greatest days of my life. It was just goosebumps.
The story, I mean, you mentioned comes directly from the mouth of Robbie. Were there any major liberties that you had to take with the story? I'm just thinking about things like the watermelon. It's so outrageous. Is that something
that's way too specific to make up, isn't it? There's a lot of folding in of scenes and characters. So Chris Briggs, who plays his manager, was his A&R person. He actually had another manager called David, and we just folded those two characters in. There's a bunch of friends he had that we folded into Nate. So just for time, you end up collapsing characters and scenes. So the scene with the watermelon, famously, when Rob left Take That, he left when they were at a studio doing their first rehearsal for a tour that they were about to go on. And at the rehearsal studio, the boys sat him down and said, "We think we want to do this tour, just the four of us." And Rob was really shocked and awkwardly just sort of looked around, and there was a table which had a platter of different fruits on it, and it had a watermelon. And he just pointed to the watermelon and went, "Does anyone mind if I take this?" And they sort of all looked at each other and went, "Yeah, sure." And so he picked up the watermelon and he walked, and before he walked out the door, he turned back to them and he held it up and he said, "So this is it. This is the end." And then he just drifted out the door. And I was like, that's such a crazy story. But then also in the recordings was this other great story, which was he used to go over to Gary's house and they would sit around in the backyard, and one by one they'd go through and tell him the things that he had done wrong. They sort of had these meetings where they would call him to the meeting, and then they would all sit around and tell him off for whatever he'd, messed up that week. But Gary had a tree that had a swing on it, so he would always swing while he was being told off. And again, I was just like, that's such a great visual of the guy who's being told off just swinging back and forth into the scene. And so we just combined those two scenes.
It's great.
The one scene that is entirely made up and isn't a fold-in is the scene on the lake with his dad. And that's because Rob's never had that conversation with his dad. And I said to him, so you've never spoken to your father about the fact that at age 7 he disappeared from your life to pursue becoming famous? And Rob was like, no. And I said, not once? Like, you didn't even broach the conversation? Like, you're both adults now, did you?
No.
And he said, no. And he said, I'm never having that conversation. And I said, well, I'm going to have to write that conversation because it makes no sense that you've never had that conversation, other than he's British. And if anyone knows anyone British, you'll understand what I mean. So yeah, that whole scene, that conversation is he's never had that conversation.
I'm assuming that Dad saw the film, and what has been
his dad hasn't seen the film, but he signed off on the script, so we had to share the script, obviously. You know, I don't know. It's going to be interesting. His mum hasn't seen the film either. His mum and his dad will see the film at the premiere in UK.
Excellent.
But yeah, it's funny. I took the line. So when I first met his dad, the very first time was in Vegas, and Rob and his dad were performing together in Vegas, and so I was in the change room, and the dad comes in and he goes, "Are you the young fella who's doing the film on my Rob?" And I went, "Yeah." And he went, "It wouldn't be a Robbie Williams if it wasn't for me." And I at the time thought, that's going in the film.
That's great. Well, Michael, what a joy to have you here. Thank you for showing up, and congratulations on your film.
And thanks so much for coming, everyone, and thanks so much for having us to the festival.
Well, thank
really.
you.